Welcome. It's a pleasure to host you here today for this PLN event on regional districts and small communities. My name is Sarah Muir and I'm director on the board, and I've been asked to host today's session, and I'll start by offering our land acknowledgement. The Planning Institute of British Columbia recognizes, acknowledges, and appreciates that we're able to live, work, and learn on the traditional territories of First Nations and Indigenous peoples of BC and the Yukon. I want to acknowledge and respect that I'm here today, gathering with all of you on the traditional and unceded territory of the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, Squamish peoples, and I invite you to acknowledge whose land you are on, the land whose traditional and cultural processes and relationships have existed immemorial and continue to this day. Acknowledging the principles of truth and reconciliation, we recognize and respect the history, languages, and cultures of the First Nation, Métis, Inuit, and all Indigenous peoples of Canada, whose presence continues to enrich our lives, this region, and our country. As I mentioned, I'm on the director of the board, and this is my third term serving. These are my colleagues, their smiling faces. We met last year to go through the strategic plan and to update it with some priorities that we're focusing on through our term. We revisited PIBC mission and value, and we collectively aim to position PIBC now as a thriving organization supporting professional planners to manage change and to continue to plan for and develop resilient, connected, inclusive, and vibrant communities. And we've got 3 priority areas that we're focusing on to achieve this mission. We're pursuing justice, equity, diversity, decolonization, and inclusion. We're also aiming to advance the profession, to raise the profile of the profession through relationships with the BC government, the Yukon Territory, other partners, and allied organizations. And we're here to enhance the value and engagement in the recruitment for the organization through building better relationships with our members and delivering what members need and want, which brings us to the activities like today's session, the Peer Learning Network. As you may know, the province of BC, the Ministry of Housing has partnered with PIBC to develop and implement a new peer learning network to support the local government staff and colleagues across the province in sharing knowledge and case studies and information with regards to the new housing and development approval legislation. I want to say how grateful the board is for the hard and dedicated work of our executive director, Dave Crosley, who's been working with Kristen Agnello. They've launched the PLL Learning Network. I also want to thank the team from City Spaces who've helped develop today's agenda and will be facilitating and keeping note of the discussions today. And a big shout out to our presenters, Chris Osborne and Peter Johnson. Now, in terms of activities to date, we had a first PLN webinar, Ask a Lawyer, was held February 23rd. That's been recorded and the presentations are up on the PLN webpage. As Susie mentioned, we've hosted regional in-person sessions through the last couple of months. We were in Prince George the end of February, then Victoria, Kelowna, and Vancouver through March. We're with you here today virtually, and then we'll be in Nelson this Thursday for a gathering in the Kootenay region. We've got 2 additional upcoming webinars. Provincial housing legislation, servicing and infrastructure is April 19th at 12 p.m. So be sure to check that out and register if you'd like to attend. And another 3rd webinar on provincial housing legislation affordability scheduled for May 29th, again at noon. So we're continuing to build on the PLL webpage and the website, adding links and resources and materials gained from these discussions, as well as information and resources from partners and additional external organizations. If you have any questions or if you have information to share with us, please feel free to email peer.learning@pibc.bc.ca, and we'll get back to you on and connect you in with the resources that we have available right now. And with that, I'll pass it back to Susie Lund to introduce the team and our presenters and to go through today's agenda. So thanks very much, all of you, for gathering. And it's a pleasure to be here today. And I'm looking forward to a really fruitful discussion. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Sarah. Yeah, as I mentioned, my name is Susie Lunn. I'm a senior community planner with City Spaces. My team from City Spaces on the call is Janelle Dirksen, who's a senior community planner as well, and then Andre Gavis. So they'll be supporting with the event today. A little bit about City Spaces. We're a consulting firm. We specialize in community planning, engagement, and development consulting. And we primarily work with municipalities and nonprofits across BC. So yeah, we're happy to be supporting PIBC in this event, and yeah, are excited about the presentations and the discussion we have, because really today is about learning from each other. Of course, this is all new, the changes to the housing legislation. So really want to bring everyone together to kind of provide an opportunity for peer learning, and hopefully you can kind of share contact information and can continue to go away and work together. You will have noticed that we've turned on the video recording for this event. So just kind of the bigger group, the plenary session will be recorded, the presentations and the Q&A. Once we go into small groups, that will not be recorded. So of course, while we're in kind of the bigger group, please mute yourself. But when we go into the small groups, of course, you turn on your video and your microphone so you can have a conversation with the group. Once we move to the Q&As after the presentations, then yeah, you can just put your questions in the chat and we'll monitor that. So I'm going to just share the my screen in terms of the shape of the event, the shape of the morning. So we're going to move to the presentation. So each speaker has about 15 minutes to provide an overview. We have Chris Osborne, the manager of planning from the District of North Cowichan, and we have Peter Johnson, who's a partner at Stewart, McDannold, Stuart, which is a Victoria-based law firm. And then we'll have about 15 minutes for question and answers for the speakers. We'll have a very short break, and then once we come back, we'll move into breakout sessions. So those will kind of be self-facilitated. So you need to identify a note taker and somebody who's willing to report back to the bigger group. And then we'll have about 10-15 minutes for a report back, and then finally closing remarks. And we should finish up about 11:30. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Chris. Chris Osborne has over 17 years of municipal experience in Canada and the UK, with time spent in both development planning and long-range planning. He holds a master's in planning from London South Bank University, in addition to a master's in nuclear astrophysics from the University of Surrey. I still can't get over that one, Chris. He's a registered professional planner. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and hand it over to Chris.
Okay, thank you, Susie. And that physics degree is no guarantee that I'm any good at technology. So first is my attempt to share the screen with you. Okay, did that work? Can you see my screen? Okay, good.
Yes.
Off to a roaring start then. Okay, thank you. As Susie said, my name is Chris Osborne, Manager of Planning in the Municipality of North Cowichan. And just to situate you with where North Cowichan is, it's Vancouver Island. I hope everyone on this call knows where Vancouver Island is. If not, it's the part of BC that's floating out in the Pacific. And specifically North Cowichan Coast Salish territory is pretty much halfway between Victoria and Nanaimo. And although we are a municipality, we look very much like a regional district. We are a district municipality. So we have 3/4 distinct urban centers in our jurisdiction, and then a whole load of agricultural land and municipal forest land in between them. And the black lines you see on the diagram there are our urban containment boundary. So we've got the community of Chemainus up in the north, Crofton in the middle, and then all this stuff around here is like the outskirts of Duncan, city of Duncan, separate municipality down here. And then we've got this sort of archipelago of urban development heading out towards Maple Bay. So many of the issues that we've encountered, I think, are germane to quite a number of the rural communities and regional districts on this call. I'm going to keep it brief, or at least as brief as I know how, because I suspect the main reason you're all here is the irresistible urge to get some free legal advice from Peter for all of your pressing concerns. But what I want to take you through very quickly is what we've done in terms of modelling Bill 44, as I'll colloquially call it, and what that means for infrastructure capacity and some of the concerns we have there, and then focus on what our approach is to get ourselves over this, the finish line of this deadline that's bearing down on us all with terrifying speed. And in fact, when I looked at the council meeting schedule that we have and the 30th of June deadline and worked back from that, I just about gave myself a coronary when I realized what has to be done starting about 3 months ago in a very short space of time. So kind of starting at the end with growth modelling, you're all doubtless very familiar with the provincial policy manual, probably have it committed to memory by now. Appendix E of that sets out the methods for calculating what the impacts are of this new legislation and what the build out looks like. It provides 2 different methodologies. It was kind of interesting. We were already doing complex build out modeling last year when the Bill 44 bomb landed in our midst, which was unfortunate in one respect, but fortunate in another, because we were able to pivot and model the specific impacts of the SMU legislation on our growth trajectory. So we've actually done both methods. Method 1, we were able to do in-house fairly crudely, and then method 2 was farmed out to consultants and produced a result that did corroborate the method 1. So there was some good concurrence between them. And the reason that the build-out stuff matters so much, and particularly perhaps in small communities where infrastructure systems are small and not perhaps readily capable of being upgraded, is our infrastructure and servicing capacity for some of these areas, and the timing for upgrades. Like, what kind of delivery trajectory are we looking at for new housing units, and what does that mean for when we need to have our updates done by? Also, implications for how we pay for these infrastructure upgrades with development cost charges, and making sure that our DCC bylaws are updated so that we're capturing SMU densities, because if we're not, we're leaving an awful lot of money on the table. And then we have our new ACC regime, which we haven't remotely had a chance to get our heads around yet. And then the other reason that it's important, of course, is all the stuff that we care about as urban planners, the environment and the social programming of our urban spaces, and what the new densities might mean for that. So I want to take you through the modelling results and how what conclusions that led us to in terms of infrastructure. So what we're seeing here are the build-out curves from business as usual, and then adding on the impact of Bill 44, starting last year, 2023, and then projecting 90 years into the future. And 90 years was our proxy for full build-out. We've now realized the zoned capacity, as it were. And you can see what the orange line there, Bill 44, it adds on a not insignificant amount to our trajectory, culminating in 90 years from now, population in excess of 100,000, compared to business as usual population of about 70,000. And I want to show you the points on this curve as it pertains to one of our urban areas. So I'm just focusing in on Crofton for legibility. The numbers on the graph are for the entire jurisdiction, but the diagram here just shows you Crofton and the urban containment boundary. And we're looking at population density of Crofton. So the darker the shading of purple, the more persons per hectare we see. So that that map of Crofton is the present day population density in the village of Crofton. And then looking at the business as usual scenario, forecasting 30 years into the future, this is what our build out over 30 years looks like in Crofton. And you can see quite a few of those lighter areas have now been shaded in. So we're seeing a generic increase in population throughout the community. But then I want to go to, well, if we add on Bill 44 now, 30 years of that, of SMU densities adding in, and you can see that it has quite a significant impact, but one that's not spatially even. So the southern part, which builds out in the near future, not affected too much. The northern part there, a lot of older buildings that are tear downs. This is a typical mill town. A lot of those houses in this area, your 1950s, 1960s boxes, which by 2053 will definitely be in a tear down and redeveloped state. And we would expect that at that point, they would probably be replaced with 3 or 4 units, so maxing out the permitted density. Projecting further into the future, and just bearing in mind that this is like people before the Second World War trying to figure out what our urban areas would look like now. So highly speculative, but 90 years is nevertheless the lifetime of a sewer pipe. So we do need to take the longest term view when considering infrastructure planning. So that is the full zoned capacity of Crofton as it is today. And then looking at when you add on the SMU and the upzoning that is part of that, we see there's quite a significant population density throughout pretty much the whole of that urban area. And the date that's of real interest to us at the moment is this one. It's 2031. And the reason for that will probably be immediately clear to you, because that's the maximum date by which any compliance extension can be requested. And what we see from this graph is that in the near future, Bill 44 doesn't do a huge amount to our population trajectory. So the difference between those two curves by the year 2021 is only about 800 units. And that's municipality wide. Not a huge amount. The greatest degree of divergence comes in this third decade here between 20 years from now and 30 years from now. And that's when Bill 44 really takes off. And a large part of that is a function of our urban fabric, and a large part of it will be coming up for renewal at that time. And that's what we saw here in Crofton, with those mid-20th century housing reaching the end of its lifetime and then being redeveloped to SMU densities. Prior to that, most of the SMU densities that we would expect are probably just in the form of suites and carriage houses. So what we learned from that, municipality-wide, the SMU density adds about 15,500 new units of housing. But looking at that shorter term deadline, our first modeling cut, first 10 years, we only realized 6% of that new capacity. So that's about 800 or 900 units out of that 15,000. And that means that there'll only be a relatively modest additional burden on our infrastructure through to 2031. And it's really in the decades after that that we're going to see the biggest impact from Bill 44. And of course, this is highly speculative, but it's the best we've got. And that's important to know about the infrastructure burden, because 2031, as I said, is the latest where we can expect a compliance extension. So barring any further evolution of the regulations, come what may, at the beginning of 2031, your infrastructure needs to be fit and ready to accommodate those SMU densities, and whatever the consequences, I suppose. So in terms of the risk and our approach, well, first we decided that given what we actually have to do, it's just not feasible to be able to request an extension in the time available by June 1st. And then we're invited to do that 45 days prior to council considering the zoning changes anyway. So it doesn't leave us any time. So assuming we don't request any compliance extension, and we're fully zoned as per the legislation come the end of June. What's the infrastructure risk? Well, where the capacity is limited, I suppose, we would then have to prioritize SMU over higher density. So if we'd planned our infrastructure capacity for X amount of growth, and then the SMU densities took us over the limit, we would probably have to prioritize SMU, and that would potentially lead us to not approving upzonings for more significant multifamily developments. That could happen. That's not an intended consequence of this, but it would be a way of dealing with limited capacity issues. Another one might be the subsequent downzoning of areas. I don't know how well that would fly. Perhaps Peter will say that that's completely unthinkable, but if we really were up against it, and additional density would subsequently be shown to blow up our pipes, then it wouldn't be unthinkable. I think to exercise a reasonable exercise of our powers would be to downzone again. I don't know how a court would view that, or how senior government would view that, but when the next storm comes, we can invite the judge and the minister down to watch the sewage flowing into the streets and ask them what they'd like us to do about it. So, and then kind of the nuclear option is withholding building permits. So just because the zoning allows for something, if issuing a building permit would tip us over the edge, then we're not under an obligation to issue that permit. All that said, we do think, for the reasons I said in the last slide, that these risks are small and manageable. So it's not the end of the world. All right, so how do we get there, bearing in mind this deadline? So there's an awful lot to do in a short period of time. So we put things into 3 different bins. So we looked at what do we actually have to do in order to achieve compliance by June 30th? What's all the stuff that we should do, but which won't necessarily bring the hammer down at the end of June? And then what's all the other stuff that we would like to do, which was in the hopper anyway, that we want to improve the way we do things. So phase 1 is really what we must do, looking at the bare minimum to achieve legal compliance and nothing more. So that is addressing the use and density both inside the urban containment boundary and outside, as per the minimum densities that the legislation requires. Because you can look at a zoning bylaw and determine immediately whether or not you're in compliance. So that's kind of non-negotiable. And then the other part is any problem site standards that clearly would, at a large scale, prevent us from realizing those permitted densities. So how we identify those, we're currently doing some stress testing. So looking at our existing zoning with no changes other than adding in the SMU densities and sketching up what that would look like when you factor in the various setbacks and height restrictions. And we've got about 30 scenarios to test. And where we're repeatedly finding that those standards are limiting the density, then those will also need to be in that first round of changes. Anything less than that is a bit more debatable and will be kind of parked. One of the issues we have is some of our zones. So here's just an example of, again, in Crofton, where we've got the same zones. There's an R1 zone, R3 zone, which exist inside and outside of the urban containment boundary. But our zoning bylaw makes no reference to the urban containment boundary. So we have to provide different zoning permissions within those zones. So the amendment isn't easy, and it's not as trivial as we're breezily invited to believe by the handbook. We do need to be rezoning individual parcels and probably creating a new zone in order to be able to achieve this, or importing our urban containment boundary in some unwieldy fashion into the zoning bylaw, which is, there's no immediately elegant way of doing this. Nevertheless, that aside, the approach again is to do the bare minimum. So, and that's not because we disagree with the legislation, we don't want to do it, but we don't have the time by June to explore competing options for how we do some of these things. So outside UCB, suites at a minimum, that's what we have to do. So this is allowing those 2 units within one residential building. There are some zones out there which do allow for detached ADUs, or in some rare cases, a duplex or something more. We just leave those alone, no change needed. But where we're invited to go further, where we can look at allowing a suite and a detached ADU, we're just going to park that discussion until after June 30th. Inside the UCB, similar kind of story. We've got very few parcels under the bare minimum, so we're looking at 4 units per parcel. Again, we want to do the minimum and we want to keep it simple. So we're saying 1 residential building, you can have up to 4 units. That's simple to administer, and it prevents wasting land by having multiple detached dwellings on a lot, which often start to look like quasi subdivisions, and fragmenting our rural areas, which is not something we want to see. The only exception to this is coach house garden suite typology. So looking at the types that we're looking to allow and not looking to allow. So your multifamily plexes, that's your 1 building with between 1 and 4 units. Duplex with suites is basically another form of a 4-plex. Single family dwelling plus suite, and then garden suite, that's the one exception to the 1 residential building rule. And then if there's sufficient frontage, 4-unit townhouse. And then anything else that involves more than 1 building, so 2 duplexes, 4 single detached, perhaps a triplex with an ADU, that would be pretty unusual, but not unthinkable. Again, leaving those for now. It's not to say we don't want to consider those in the future, but for the purposes of achieving compliance by June 30th, we're just not going there. So we finally get ourselves over that deadline and we send our letter to the minister saying that we've done what we have to do. We then enter phase 2, which is optimizing. So that's where we look at those additional permissions that we're invited to do. So should we be allowing now not only a suite, but a suite and an ADU in those rural areas? Should we be contemplating other forms or other configurations of achieving the 4 lot or 4 dwellings per lot within the urban containment boundary? Well, those are value judgments as to whether we want to go there or whether we want to choose option A or option B. And so council needs time to be able to debate those and if it wishes to canvass the views of its electorate. And we're shortchanging council and we're shortchanging the public if we hitch these things to the coattails of the other stuff that has to be done by June the 1st. We're not providing them an opportunity to debate these things, which are debatable and are subject to nuance. So that was quite a fundamental principle for us, is that the package we put in front of council to give initial readings to in May is basically there's nothing to discuss here. We have to do this. Anything else that is discussable, we want to give adequate time for that discussion. And we want to give council the opportunity to hear from residents as to whether they'd prefer option A or option B. So that comes after. And that would also then include the site standards. So do we adopt one of the packages, or do we adopt an amalgam of it, or do we go our own way? Again, there's plenty to discuss there. And parking standards, of course, there's always, wouldn't be planning without an argument about parking. And then finally, we have all the stuff that we want to do. And this ties in then with the imperative to update the official community plan as well, which we're required to do. But tweaking our development permit guidelines to make sure that they're jiving well with the SMU densities, looking at alternative forms of housing, such as tiny homes, float homes, etc. All stuff that's recommended in our official community plan, and then tweaking general regulations and our approach to subdivision. So all of that stuff will follow on. And then one final thought before I hand it over to Peter is one thing we found is sort of doing the scenario testing, you get drawn into a lot of what ifs. And it's helpful to remember that you can't achieve perfection. So the real world is messy. And when you try and put some regulatory box around it, you're really just hoping to capture the bulk of scenarios. So that middle of the bell curve, sort of 85–90% of scenarios are what you want to capture. Those are your reasonable intended outcomes from a piece of legislation. But you can always find funny situations and what ifs. You can always find little loopholes, things that you wanted to regulate, but which somehow slipped the net. When you're always going to find some ludicrous situation that shouldn't be regulated, but is captured by it. And it's helpful just to remember that that's inevitable. Otherwise, you spend too much time trying to make a perfect regulation, and we don't have the time to do that, and it's not a possible task anyway. So we kind of hold this diagram in our mind that we're not, although we're planners, we're not perfect. Hard to believe, and we're not going to achieve perfection. So doing our best is hopefully good enough. All right, well, that's all I've got to say. So I'm going to shut up and stop sharing and turn it over to Peter. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Chris. It's a helpful overview of what you're attempting to do in North Cowichan, and yeah, good words of advice to live by and generally, I think, but yeah, especially for this this time in our planning life. All right, so Peter, are you able to share your screen? Chris, it looks like you're still sharing something on the screen. Did you stop sharing? Oh, there we go. Okay. Thanks, Peter.
Can you see that?
Yes, and Peter, let me just pause you for a second while I introduce you.
Sure.
So yeah, welcome to Peter Johnson, who's a partner at Stewart, McDannold, Stuart, which is a Victoria-based law firm that provides legal services to local governments throughout British Columbia. Peter works in the firm's solicitors group, providing legal advice to local governments on a wide variety of matters, including interpretation of local government legislation, planning and development law, real estate, and other commercial transactions. Peter is a frequent contributor to the firm's publications and has made numerous presentations on a variety of local government topics. So I'll hand it over to you, Peter. Thank you.
Hopefully everybody can still see that.
Yes.
Thank you, Susie, and thanks, Chris. I found your presentation very informative and helpful.
Peter, we're seeing your presentation mode.
I'm sorry?
Susie,
Oh,
are you seeing presentation mode, or is that just me?
Yes, I can see it as well. Are you able to change it to what should we change it to full screen, Janelle?
Slideshow mode.
seeing if I can change that. Hang on. Screen. How's that?
Yeah, that's full screen. Perfect.
Yes, that's
Okay,
great. Thank
great.
you.
Thank you. Okay. It doesn't take not having a degree, well, it doesn't take having a degree in astrophysics not to have the command over the technology that one would want in these circumstances. So anyway. So yes, thank you, everyone. Thanks to the organizers for inviting me to participate today. I wasn't entirely sure what participants and those attending might find helpful. So if I can move this forward. I thought I would just do a brief overview of SMU legislation bill 44. I'm sure you're all familiar with it, and as Chris has mentioned, I'm sure you've all read the provincial policy guidelines and committed them to memory at this point, but I thought it might be helpful just to provide an overview. In providing the overview, I'll talk a little bit about what you must do and not do and by when, and discuss a few issues of concern. I was given in advance some questions that came from people who were going to be participating from regional districts and small communities. And so I've set out those questions in some of the slides, and I'll do my best to answer them, and then we can move into the Q&A session. And if anything else comes up, or if anybody needs clarification, we can deal with that. So as I'm sure you all know all too well by now, Bill 44 will require you, or does require you, your local government, to amend zoning bylaws to accommodate SMU, small scale multi-unit housing, in various restricted zones, subject to some exemptions. For the purposes of the legislation, the restricted zones are and the requirements are tiered. So the lowest tier is under section 481.3 sub 3. So this applies to zones in which the permitted residential use is restricted to detached single-family dwellings, as you know. And under that section, the zoning bylaw has to be amended to permit a use and density to accommodate at least one additional dwelling within the detached dwelling or on the same parcel. Moving up through the second and third tiers, the restricted zone definitions expanded to capture zones in which the permitted uses are restricted to single-family dwellings and duplexes, with potential for additional dwellings. Tier 2, 41.3 sub 4 applies to all parcels within a restricted zone that are within an urban containment boundary established by a regional growth strategy. That may not be applicable to everyone attending here today. And also applications to municipalities' population greater than the prescribed population, which is 5,000. And for this second tier, the zoning bylaw has to accommodate at least the prescribed number of housing units, which is 3 for parcels 280 square meters or smaller, and 4 for larger parcels. And then, of course, we're into 41.3 sub 5, which applies to municipalities, parcels within the prescribed size, at least, that are wholly or partly within the prescribed distance from a bus stop meeting the prescribed requirements set out in the regulations. And the prescribed number of housing units in that case is 6. So tiers 3, 4, and 5. And I expect most of the people attending here today will be mostly concerned with the first tier. There are exemptions. So there's an exemption for hazard lands arising under the regulations. So this exemption applies to all restricted zones, tiers 1, 2, and 3, as I call them. So if land is subject to a hazardous condition, development to the required density would significantly increase the threat or risk. The threat or risk cannot be practically mitigated, and you have obtained a qualified professional's report that certifies all of the above. The land is exempt from the SMOO requirement. There are other exemptions that apply to tiers 2 and 3. So, for example, land protected under the Heritage Conservation Act, land that is not connected to a local government water sewer system, and large parcels, and land within a transit-oriented area under the Bill 47 legislation. So if an exemption applies, or if you feel an exemption applies, you have to give written notice to the minister as soon as practicable after adopting the zoning bylaw. You have to identify all land to which the exemption applies and identify the provisions under which the exemption is exercised. So for regional districts, small communities dealing with hazard land concerns, that is likely what the notice is going to have to indicate to the minister if you feel you qualify for an exemption. We'll talk about that a little bit later when we get into some of the questions and answers. Chris mentioned timelines and extensions. Of course, the June 30th, 2024 deadline for amendments to the zoning bylaw is coming up very quickly. The legislation allows for applications for an extension for the purposes of complying. Applications have to be submitted on or before June 1, 2024, unless there are extraordinary circumstances, in which case the application deadline is extended to June 30th. And the minister has somewhat limited discretion for granting extensions. So if you are in the midst of upgrading infrastructure for the area and you need additional time to complete those infrastructure upgrades to accommodate the increased use and density, that would provide grounds for an extension. If the infrastructure serving the community or the part of the community that you're concerned about is such that compliance by the deadline is likely to increase the risk to health, public safety, or the environment, that provides grounds for the granting of an extension. So if you're a regional district, for example, with a water service that supplies potable water to a small community, and you are dealing with issues around upgrading the infrastructure to meet standards required under the Drinking Water Protection Act and so on and so forth. And if additional housing units added to the community would create risks to the occupants of those units, there's, I think, a potential for application for an extension. But again, the deadline would be June 1, 2024 to apply. And there is an opportunity for the minister to grant extensions in the case of extraordinary circumstances that otherwise prevent compliance. And if you look at the provincial guidelines, the definition of extraordinary circumstances is fairly restrictive. So examples given: major wildfire or flood events. So I wouldn't count on being able to rely on an application or putting forward an application based on extraordinary circumstances unless something disastrous along those lines occurs. Official community plans, of course, you know that following the adoption of an official community plan, all bylaws adopted by the local government have to be consistent. Well, what if your bylaws, your SMU bylaws, aren't consistent with the OCP? The legislation provides that the consistency requirement doesn't apply before the prescribed date, which is December 31, 2025. Other requirements and no-nos: you must not hold a public hearing on a zoning bylaw proposed for the sole purpose of complying with legislation. You must consider the provincial guidelines before adopting the bylaw. As Chris mentioned, I'm sure you're all familiar with the guidelines. In formulating your zoning regulations, you should have regard to the site standards and recommended zoning regulations set out in the guidelines. You're not required to follow them, but you are required to consider the provincial guidelines as a whole. And I would think that in presenting whatever bylaw amendments you have formulated to your council or board for consideration, it would be advisable to make reference to the guidelines in your report. And if there are any substantial variances or differences between what's recommended and what in the guidelines and what you are recommending to your council or board, you might want to include some kind of statement to that effect and the rationale for departing from not following the guidelines. Other requirements. So there are rules around conditional density rules, density bonus bylaws. You can't establish bonus density requirements in order to for people to avail themselves of the permitted SMU use and density requirements, with one limited exception that only applies to municipalities who are subject to that transit stop requirement. You must not exercise any of the following powers in a manner that unreasonably prohibits or restricts the use of density required. Designation of DP areas is one. We'll talk about that in a little bit, but there are some others as well, including designation of heritage conservation areas and other land use regulations. There are some changes to the legislation concerning housing need reports. So those are going to be required to address housing needs for 5 and next 20 years. And there's provision in the legislation for a requirement for interim housing reports. The new deadline for the adoption or the receipt of these new housing needs reports is December 31, 2028. And OCPs are going to have to address housing needs over that 20-year planning period. Well, what if you don't meet the deadline? You don't adopt the zoning bylaw by the date required, you haven't got an extension, you will receive a notice from the minister giving you 30 days to alter bylaw. And if you don't do that, the minister can make an order that does the work for you. So here are some Q&As that I received in advance that I'll try my best to answer. Do you need, concerning hazardous conditions exemptions, do you need to get updated reports from a registered professional, or can you utilize existing information? That's not spoken to explicitly in the regulation, which provides for the exemption. I think what this means is that an existing report could be used to, could be relied upon in deciding that an exemption applies, but the report must address all the requirements of the regulation. So you would have to carefully review the report and consider whether the QP who wrote the report for you specifically comments on all the required uses and density under the SMU legislation. How old is the report? Have conditions changed in a way that could affect the QP's opinion? And has the QP stated that the risk cannot be practically mitigated? I think that when you consider all of that, reliance on reports that you may have received in the past in preparation of or updating official community plans and identifying at a high level hazardous areas in the municipality may not be particularly appropriate for reliance in this context. But that's not to say that you do not have other authorities and powers to deal with any hazard lands issues that may arise, including your development permit powers and building inspector powers to require reports at the point at which a building permit is applied for.
Peter, I'm sorry to interrupt, but we have about one or 2 minutes left so that we can have time for the bigger Q&A session.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll just deal with infrastructure concerns and then we'll move on to the next to the Q&A session. So infrastructure concerns was asked, local service area infrastructure, how to ensure protection of a finite system. I think this is one area in which the guidelines sort of gloss over the potential problems that small communities and regional districts may be facing. I think the first question to ask in any case would be, what is and is there a risk to health, public safety, or the environment, and are there grounds for seeking an extension from the minister? With regards to regulatory bylaws, you should review them. Do the bylaws clearly state out conditions for connection to and use of the service that provide protection to the local government from increases in demands that are over and above the capacity of the existing system? If the bylaw requires connection to and use of the system, is there a potential for allowance of private wells and septic systems? And are amendments to the bylaw in that regard worth considering? And finally, you do have your infrastructure financing tools, development cost charges, the works and services bylaw requirements, and your latecomer arrangements. So I'll stop there, and maybe that some of the other questions that I was going to get to come up in the Q&A session, but thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Peter. So yeah, now we'll have a general question and answer for the two presenters. If you do have a question or a comment, put it in the chat, and my colleague Andre will help moderate, repeat the questions, and direct it to either of the speakers. I see we have the first one in there from Gary, so I'll hand it over to you, Andre.
Thank you, Susie. I will just add to what Susie already said, that please indicate to who you direct your questions to and place them in the chat. So I think first question is probably for Peter. I will read it out loud. During earlier provincial webinars, provincial staff indicated that the definition of SMU restricted site exclude parcels currently zoned as single-family dwelling with a secondary suite and an accessory dwelling unit, 3 units total. Has this been confirmed?
Can you just repeat the question again?
Sure. So in the previous seminars, it's been indicated that the definition of SMU restricted site excludes parcels currently zoned as single-family dwelling with a secondary suite and an accessory dwelling unit, 3 units total. Has this been confirmed?
I don't know of anything by way of confirmation in terms of an official communication or policy statement from the province.
Okay.
But that if my math is correct, that appears to be in accordance with my understanding of the legislation.
Thank you. I think the second question is also for you. Any templates for letters to the minister? Are they available?
Yeah, seeking an extension.
I think in general, for confirming that the compliance of the municipalities or asking for extensions.
I don't have a template letter developed as yet. Some of the other law firms who are working on this might, but I don't think the content of the letter is going to be such that it would be difficult to create, an appropriate communication.
Waiting for more questions to pop up in the chat. So there is a question. My interpretation is that if single family detached zone permits a secondary suite and an accessory dwelling unit, then it meets SMU requirements in rural areas. Can you maybe, Peter, confirm?
Yes.
Okay,
That's my understanding as well. So again, the restricted zones definition for most rural areas would be a zone in respect to which the permitted residential use would, but for the section, be restricted to single-family dwellings. So if you have a zone in which accessory dwellings are already permitted or secondary suites are permitted within the principal residence, I think you're not within the definition of the restricted zone.
We have another question. Has the province indicated any changes to building schemes as the condos and other on-title restrictions that may contradict SMUR? Probably on you, Peter.
Not that I'm aware of. Now, generally speaking, building schemes and other private restrictive covenants are a matter of agreement between the owners of the parcels that are subject to the building scheme or the covenant. Your task as a municipality, regional district, is to amend your bylaws such that your bylaws are not an impediment to the development of an additional dwelling unit or dwelling units on the parcel, the extent the SMU legislation requires that. If there are restrictions on title by way of covenants or building schemes that prevent owners from being able to avail themselves of the entitlement to additional uses and densities, that's really not your concern at the end of the day.
Thank you. Waiting for more questions now. There is another one. Is it correct that additional parking spaces are not required for the additional density that will be permitted?
That's in relation to,
I believe, SMU.
yes.
So yes, they won't be required.
The parking limitations apply to tier 3, I believe. You can still, my understanding is you can still require off-street parking for tier 1 parcels. you can't exercise your authority to adopt land use regulations in a manner that would unreasonably restrict the use of the land for the base SMU density that the legislation requires or permits. So if your parking requirements were such as to, in any particular context, prevent people from having an additional dwelling unit on the property, that would be problematic.
Thank you.
So Andre, we have time for probably just one or two more questions.
Okay, so we have 2 more questions. Those will be the last ones. Was the build-out modeling completed by North Cowichan eligible for capacity in terms of dollars? Chris, this is probably for you.
Well, we certainly hope so. Otherwise, it will put a $45,000 hole in our finances. Yeah, our interpretation of the slice of the funding that we got from the province is that contract was absolutely eligible for those expenditures. Even though we had begun it before the Bill 44 stuff landed, I think that still made it eligible.
Thank you. So last question. Were the OCP designated properties as commercial and industrial, but the properties are currently zoned as residential restricted zones? Are we obliged to allow SMU density on these properties? So
Yeah, if they're currently zoned.
currently
to
zoned
allow
residential, yeah.
currently zoned residential, and if the zoning is such that the properties are in a restricted zone, then yes, you are required to implement the SMU legislation.
Andre, I
And
think
that's obviously a situation where you would subsequently have to amend your OCP to bring it into alignment with the SMU regulations and the new zoning.
Andre, let's do one more question, and then maybe Peter and Chris can respond to the others in the chat, and then we'll obviously have more discussion during the small group sessions as well.
Okay, so last question for Peter. With respect to exemptions, would you please confirm that the certification from qualified professionals must include that, first, the land is subject to a hazardous condition, second, development to density permitted under the Act would significantly increase the risk or threat, and 3, confirmation that the risk cannot be mitigated. The regulation seems to say that only the first 2 are required. My intention isn't to be a stickler, but to clarify whether number 3 is required, because this is likely to be a particular onerous and costly requirement. So whether only 1 or 2 applies, or even the requirement number 3 is required.
Okay, let me just take a look and check that, and I will hop into the Q&A with that.
Great. Susie, how about I launch the poll now?
Yeah, we want to have a quick poll of everybody. Just, we know we have folks from around the province, and we're just kind of curious where you're joining us from. So before we have our break, please answer the poll, and we'll share the results here shortly. How are we doing? Has everybody responded, Andre?
We're about 80% participants.
All right, another few seconds, and then we can share the results, and then we'll go for a quick break. So we'll reconvene at 10:36, and then we'll discuss what the plans are for the small group breakouts, and we'll go from there. All right, shall we share the results, Andre? Great, so we have a variety of people from around the province, it looks like. large contingent from Metro Van, some from Capital. Great. Well, it's nice to see representation from around the province. So yeah, we'll sign off for 5 minutes and we'll meet back here at 10:36.